Every enterprise wants to go on a transformation journey. What it is, what are the challenges organization face, we are going to discuss today. Are you ready? Modern Enterprise Tech Show. We talk about various topics related to modern enterprise in this show. We sort of live stream it every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific. Today I have with me Andy Shafer from Red Hat, who is going to talk about what is transformation, why is it hard, how organizations can really take advantage of this and transform themselves. Andy, can you introduce yourself and we'll go from there?
Well, thanks for having me, Krish. How's everyone else doing out there? It's a crazy time. Like he said, I'm at Red Hat, and we're really focused on helping organizations sort of change their behavior and their operating models to take advantage of the new technology. My background before this, I've been in the DevOps and cloud space for a good 10 years. I don't know when we first met, Krish, but it was like probably Cloud Expo or one of these crazy things. It's been a long time.
I think we first met in during OpenStack days, the early days of OpenStack, I guess.
Yeah, so I was in OpenStack around the very beginning.
Yeah, very beginning, and we either met in Cloud Expo or Cloud Connect or one of the OpenStack conferences.
I'm pretty sure I was at Cloud Scaling at the time.
Yeah, you were at Cloud Scaling. That's right. That's right. So, what are you doing at Red Hat? Can you talk a little bit about, because the Global Transformation Office seems like something exotic. Like it was not there in Red Hat when I was there. Can you talk about what you folks are doing there?
Absolutely. So let's just start by saying unequivocally, I probably hate the word transformation more than anyone. There's a few reasons why, but it's kind of ambiguous in ways that one is sufficiently vague to do lots of things, but then also that's the problem. So the kind of hypothesis and what my team's focused on helping the Red Hat customer base do is from the perspective of the cloud native technology, the rate limiting kind of process is the actual behaviors of the humans involved. Right. So whether you're talking about any of the other cloud providers, any of their platforms, I think this is actually true of any tool to some degree. But it's like you need to learn new behaviors to take full advantage of the tooling. What gets particularly complicated when you start talking about the cloud native ways of working is, and especially in these complicated enterprises, is you often have multiple personas, multiple roles that have to simultaneously change to get the most out of it. And so it's like whatever's the slowest layer, or whatever's the slowest kind of change is the weakest link or the slowest step. That's what keeps you from making the progress, right? So transformation to me, just like being kind of maybe like a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also serious, is when you look at what the enterprises want to be able to do, it's really to just catch up to what the startups can do, or what the startups could do in 2010 or maybe even 2000.
Yeah.
And there's this tension that all of them feel individually, because they take for granted that they can have, whatever kind of digital experiences it as an individual, right? Like we're constantly talking over video. We have these phones in our pockets that are connected to all the information that humans have ever created. You push and people will bring you food. Back when you could leave the house, you push a button and someone will come get you in a car. And so like all this kind of magic marrying the digital with the physical reality has been created. And then you get into the average enterprise, and even if they have a lot of developers and they have an investment in IT, they're not particularly good at creating those kind of experiences for their customers or their employees.
So there is quite a bit of confusion even with the term transformation. Like when I talk to some enterprise CIOs or decision makers, They think just embracing cloud native technologies or even dumping their existing applications into cloud is what transformation means. Can you sort of like tell us the connection between cloud native and transformation?
So I like to reference other people's art, and if you look at the way analysts talk about digital transformation, there's kind of like a few buckets. There's a few big buckets, and so like one big bucket is digital or digitizing the business process, and bringing like more software to bear on what you're doing, and sometimes those are vertical solutions or really industry specific, and that's why you see things like Salesforce.com or SAP in the Magic Quadrant or whatever about digital transformation. Then there's this other big bucket that's more about what I'm talking about, which is the ability to create those digital experiences that I was mentioning a moment ago. And so then when you look at what I think cloud native really represents, and this is another thing I was sort of at the beginning of like creating some of the language here, and we use this language at my previous employer before there was a foundation named this way. And so when you look at what cloud native means to me, it's really taking all of the patterns that evolved building those systems, these web scale kind of like flexible, resilient infrastructures and architectures, and taking those and creating a dynamic community that can reuse those patterns in the same way, right? So if you look at the evolution of a bunch of these things, there's like common patterns that emerged that don't necessarily have anything to do with Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes has sort of become the center of a lot of the conversation. But if you look at the evolution of like pick Netflix, right? Because that's something that's very public. You have this microservice architecture that essentially had the same deployment dynamics that we see with containers, but it was originally built with VMs, right? So if you look at the way the internal the microservices for Netflix were deployed at one point, they were baking AMIs like we bake containers now, deploying those. They also developed this like client-side load balancing pattern that's like, you look at the rest of this suite of open source tools from Netflix, you have Ribbon, you have these circuit breakers, you have like tracing like built into like these different open source patterns, but it was very specific to Netflix, and it was particularly specific, or a lot of it was specific to Java, right? Mm-hmm. And then you go to like, I just happen to know some internals for different things, but it's like almost every one of these architectures at some point started building asynchronous event-driven things. They had these like proxy client-side load balancing patterns. Like you just start to get that same emergent thing. And one way I think about this is, and this also relates to the process, right? So it's like you have the tools, but then you also have the process. And what we have in a lot of the enterprise right now is they have access to these tools. Like you can go to the CNCF and you can grab all those projects, but you don't necessarily have the process. And in a lot of cases, and I've had customers tell us this pretty explicitly, it's actually easier in their organization right now because of their governance, risk, and compliance and a bunch of these other factors. It's easier in some cases for them to deploy onto their legacy systems than it is onto the new container platform, right? So it's like this impedance mismatch between what we all know is possible with these tools, and then, for a variety of reasons, some social, some technical, some just because that's the way we do things here, these organizations are kind of limited in both the pace and the quality that they can deliver those digital outcomes.
So if I understand, like the cloud native is associated with some architectural patterns, some operational patterns, and the processes that connect developers and operations to sort of work towards that end goal of digitizing the enterprise. So does it have to follow what some of the leaders like Netflix and Google and Amazon has established? Or for the reason I'm asking is, for some time the conversation about cloud native centered around 12-factor applications, and then the other side you had enterprises saying that, oh no, we have stateful applications, so we need to do that. All that conversations were happening for a long time. So how do you sort of like bring these two worlds together? Like I understand that Netflixes of the world and Amazons of the world had established set of patterns which are showing results. But again, traditional organizations really think about it and sort of like take that leap.
So this is like interesting kind of historical artifact to talk through, and some of the other stuff I was involved definitely had this notion of the factors, and I think they're interesting to frame, but they're also somewhat limiting. And I would argue if you look at what Netflix did and what Google did, they're not strictly 12 factor in a large regard, and we could go through what I mean, but 12 factor is sort of this statement that's essentially Heroku's propaganda, right? And it like gets some gravity and people kind of get into it, and it becomes this sort of banner that people wave, and I was certainly part of that at different phases. But then when you think about what that represents, in order to have a 12-factor app that you can run, you also need that 12-factor ops. You need that 12-factor platform that keeps all those promises, right? And so if you want to walk through all 12 factors, they essentially imply that there's this other thing that exists that keeps all those promises, right? Mm-hmm. So like the one that you brought up about state, the 12-factor position here is that you're going to write to this data service. Like all your state will be kept in this data service, right? That data service has to exist. Like someone has to operate that data service. Someone has to like keep promises about the durability, the scalability, the reliability of that data service in order for you to keep promises about the 12 factors. Another thing that I think is interesting when you look at 12 factors and like the historical context of it, for one thing, it's really sort of centered on like web appy type of things, which is fine, but that's not the only thing. There's a lot of other interesting problems to solve that aren't necessarily kind of building those kind of services. And then it also doesn't talk about lots of other things that become kind of primary concerns for an enterprise. Like one thing that's not mentioned whatsoever in the 12-factor manifesto, we'll call it, is like there's no mention of security. There's no mention of like a bunch of these other qualities, right? Mm-hmm. Like even if you have a 12-factor platform, that doesn't necessarily give you an architecture that's resilient. That doesn't necessarily, like, it gives you some building blocks to start to be able to think through some of that, but without like real measurement, real engineering, you don't have any understanding of the quantified promises you can keep with respect to that deployment, right? You have a knob, you can turn up the things, you can kind of play with it. But if you've ever been through a real like a architecture that needed to scale because it's at the limit of some of these things, and often those things are those data services, then you have to like revisit a bunch of those assumptions to kind of get to that next level where the platform can keep promises. So there's kind of like this constant interplay where lots of the things that are kind of 12-factor appropriate are perfect for an enterprise. If they had those platforms in place, they could do a lot of stuff with it. But then they've also got the legacy where, like, this is part of the modernization process right now, and this is something that I've done quite a bit of, in my role now and in previous roles, where it's like you have some estate, right? You have like maybe thousands of apps even, and you have to make decisions about them. And the idea, at least I think at this point, most people have realized that lift and shift is not going to get you there. Yeah. Like a lot of people tried that, and it was like more expensive. Like their cloud deployment actually more expensive than their data center in some of those cases, because the promises they're able to keep and the pricing models and a bunch of other things are different. And so you're not going to get the benefit unless you go through that. But do you want to really go through every single one of those 1,000 apps and migrate them all to like these microservice architectures? I'd argue that's actually a bad decision as well, right? So there's like this middle path where you look at the portfolio, you rationalize the goals of the business against, what are we trying to do? So anything that I think needs to change because part of the process, or the part of the benefit of these microservices, is that you're decoupling functionality so you can have independent deploys. And it's not always about the tech, it's about enabling those different feature teams to not have to wait for the single monolithic deployment in order to make progress and give feedback on their features, right? So if you want to explore some kind of new features, let's get that into the new architectures, because then we can take advantage of all these tricks that we've developed with, modern software delivery to kind of explore that. If you have something that's having a problem scaling, then by all means, let's visit that architecture. And if you have something that's expensive because of, either licenses or incidents or what have you, then let's revisit that. But if you have something that doesn't need to change, doesn't need to scale, not expensive at all, like, why would you go change that? That's perfect. Let's keep it.
Yeah. So I totally agree. In fact, some of what you talked sort of leads to what I plan to talk next. So before we go, like if you are watching live, I do see some people watching it live, and we are talking about enterprise digital transformation and what are the challenges there and how it is going to help enterprise stakeholders understand how they can change and achieve the transformation. So if you have any questions for Andy, if you're watching it live, you can add it here and I'll ask him. Otherwise, you add your thoughts in the comments and we will sort of like revisit them sometime in the future. So Andy, like the things you talked about, that is like re-architecting the application, the lift and shift is not going to work, and the promises you need to make, and the trust you need to develop. This sort of leads into the next conversation, which is about the challenges people have as they try to modernize their organization. So based on your conversation with the enterprise customers over the past several years, what are some of the challenges you see in organizations?
So I've been talking a bit about these kind of 5 failures, and that stuff we've kind of emerged and evolved in my little core group of the GTO at Red Hat. But I think before we talk about those patterns, there's also just this like notion of inertia and like how we do things here, and people, there's the common refrain that change is inevitable. And I think in organizations and in individuals, there's also this aspect that the resistance to change is also inevitable. Yeah. And furthermore, there's like a psychology to it where, and in the Western world, like our last names are essentially the vocation of our ancestors, right? So when you have attached your identity to this task, this work you do, and then someone comes and tells you that you're going to do this new work, or that you're going to do your work this new way, then I think there's a reaction in some personalities where, what are you talking about? I'm an expert in this thing, and that's me. Like I've defined myself as this like developer or the sysadmin or what have you. And so when you tell people they're going to do this work in a new way, then they kind of feel like you're erasing their identity, and so they'll kind of create this immune response and resistance to that. And that's not just like that's all of these conversations going back however long. Like, when I was involved in Agile community since the mid 2000, 2004, there's like all the DevOps and Puppet and Chef, and it's like the same patterns where it's like, here's these new tools, and there's so many resistance to changing the way that we work. Right, and that's like this kind of common thing that you recognize across all these things. And then these 5 patterns I've been articulating and sharing in some of the other content and presentations is what I call. So there's 5 patterns. There's other patterns too, but these are like interesting enough to kind of articulate or often enough. There's what I call a leadership failure, a product failure, a development failure, architecture failure, and an operations failure. And so those patterns and those capabilities in an organization, and it gets like super interesting to think about like how those capabilities interact. But just to articulate it, the leadership failure is essentially that you don't have sponsorship for actually doing new ways of working. right? And so there's this tension that happens in a lot of organizations where, someone read the buzzwords about DevOps and the cloud native, and they read the State of DevOps report and Accelerate, maybe Phoenix Project, whatever. But then when it comes to the reality, like, they're not prepared to like melt all of that frozen middle, all that management, like all these like org chart things. And so there's maybe like new titles, like you create the little DevOps team, but you're not really revisiting the fundamentals of how people are working. And so that's sort of prevented at the leadership level. So the next one is what I call the product failure. And this is, related to, I witnessed across a bunch of, we sort of mentioned OpenStack, but there's lots of examples where organizations have budgeted some investment in some IT, in some project, but they don't really have a full hypothesis about how that's going to create business value or connect to support some other mission. And so you can spend all the time, all the money, all the resources that you don't want to build something that doesn't matter, and it still doesn't matter. Like it doesn't change the game. And so you can see this on the infrastructure side. You also see this lots on the application side, where someone gets a budget for something that they're going to create. There's like this time, and I still think you see this a little bit, but it seems like it slowed down a bit, where it's like every company has to have a mobile app.
Yeah.
We don't know why, but we're like going to build one, right? Or like whatever. And so you like end up with random corporations have a mobile app, and you download it, and it's like literally useless. I don't know what they spent to get it developed, but more than $0. In some cases, I'm pretty sure it's millions, but it's like not connected to a business value. It's not connected to some hypothesis. It's not even iterated. It's just a project that like exists, and then it like doesn't change, right? And so that product failure is very, very common. And like the new way to frame this is really about modeling a hypothesis, doing whatever kind of things you can to minimize the risk, test those hypotheses, and not do those like big 3-4 year projects that you can like in some cases you can see these projects are actually going to fail very, very early in the 3-4 year plan, but like no one changes the plan because it's budgeted and we got to deliver it, and like no one questions it. Then the development thing is sort of, in some ways, it's got the most attention, and so in some ways that makes it the least interesting to me. But that's sort of the center of gravity for like lots of the agile practices, and this kind of combination of technical skills and communication skills that allow you to take requirements from your product that you've validated and then put them into the machinery and get something out the other side that has some fidelity to that vision of the requirements, right? And certain organizations struggle with this, but it's like that's one of the more kind of developed and articulated communities of practice. Mm-hmm. Then there's the architecture failure, which I think is interesting because it's set up as a straw man in kind of the agile, the agile sort of narrative is like, oh, architecture, it's like not this thing we do. We're just going to write code. Yeah. And there's lots of stories I could tell, but I think, and I've gone full circle on this because, basically I was one of those people and I defended all these like things about it. But I think if you don't have some way to reconcile the architecture across these big complex projects, and in some ways these platforms are the perfect point to kind of do some of that. But you can one get where everything's all over the place and you're not going to benefit from the common reuse of these patterns. But then also, to me, architecture, that like the way I use this word is closer to the way people kind of use it in the velocity community or DevOps community, and it's really about thinking through this combination of quantified and qualified promises you can keep, right? So like, what's the latency? What's the scalability? What's the bunch of these other qualities and ilities, and can you quantify them? Like how does this thing fail? How does it scale? Where in a lot of organizations, architect is sort of this like quasi vendor management with the PowerPoint connecting like this box that came from one vendor to like this other box that came from another vendor. Mm-hmm. And I think if you build real systems, you quickly learn that there's a value to like some of this modeling, thinking through it from first principles, doing some of it, validating some of it with experiments. before you get it into production, which brings us to the last one, which is the operational failures, which I also would argue is the defining advantage of the true cloud natives, right? So if you look at what the cloud natives are able to accomplish, the promises they're able to keep with respect to reliability, even though all of them still have outages from time to time, then like that's the skill set, that's the competency that was developed running these massive web infrastructures before cloud was even a thing, right? So like you look at Amazon, who sort of defined the space, they run this massive e-commerce infrastructure before they productize any of this stuff. And most of these enterprises trying to kind of come into this like don't have that operational excellence. Another thing I would also point out here is even the best organizations in the world, right? And like people now are kind of like fond of the SRE and like some of these other words, and they started changing their titles to SRE instead of DevOps, and that's fine. But Google doesn't believe that their automation is something that you can like just neglect. Like they need humans. They need like smart people that are making good decisions moment to moment to maintain the reliability that we all take for granted from Google. And so that's like the 5 kind of failure modes that I see in a lot of these enterprise engagements. And then what I also try to help people think about in the way that we engage from a Red Hat perspective with services we're trying to do is like, let's reframe each of those failures as an opportunity to be better, to do these things in new ways. So it's like, leadership, what does it mean to sponsor change? Product, what does it mean to validate your hypothesis? Development, like what can we do to set up the chain of requirements to deliver them? Let's think through these architectures and the promises you need to be able to keep. And then last but not least, let's get some operational capability, get operational excellence. Not everyone necessarily needs to be Google, but like we can definitely do it better than we are.
Yeah, we are going to talk about how we can sort of handle these 5 failure modes. But before we go there, does the organizational silos, the walls that exist between various stakeholders in the organization, does it play a role in contributing to these failure modes?
Absolutely, and I mean I think that's part of the new ways of working. So there's sort of this what I would consider a misinterpretation of like DevOps conversations where people are like, you got to tear down all the silos, no silos, no silos, and to me that's not what I ever thought was the strategy. It's not about tearing down silos. It's about making sure you have the proper feedback loops and communication mechanisms between these communities of practice, right? Because it's like not about creating one big pile of everyone without any clear accountability, without any clear expertise. It's about making sure, and especially when you think about the scale and the things that you need to be able to do, to get to kind of like these cloud native architectures, like you have these layers, right? So this is like something I talk about is like cloud native operating model. So like very famous, even before DevOps is a word, interview with Werner Vogels at Amazon. You build it, you run it, right? That's a 2006 interview. Like people quote that all the time. You build it, you run it. What Werner's talking about in 2006 at Amazon, this is the same year EC2 was launched, is predicated on a bunch of these foundational infrastructure abstractions being available through an API, right? So there's like this foundational infrastructure at the physical layer. There's infrastructure as a service. There's these data services, platform services. All of those have operational burdens. All those have expert teams running them. When he's talking about the 2 pizza team, that's you build it, you run it. They're all standing on the shoulders of that operational excellence. And the thing that they run is just the very, very tip of that iceberg, the little cherry on top of the sundae. That's the service that they run. They're not running that data service. They're not provisioning the infrastructure. They're not doing all these things that like traditionally people considered operations, like because that was all abstracted at that point. And a lot of these cloud natives have done that before. You could argue, Google did it in some ways even better than Amazon did internally, but they weren't as good at thinking through like the APIs and the productized version of it.
Yeah. So before we talk a little deeper into how organizations can bring it all together, can you sort of lay out the one you're talking about, the scope economy? What does it mean in the sense of organizations' modernization strategy? Can you sort of lay out the landscape, and then we will discuss deeply about it?
So the scope economy is something that I learned from my teammate Jabe, and so Jabe Bloom is part of my team at Red Hat, and he's working on a PhD in design at Carnegie Mellon, and it's specifically focused on designing the transitions in behavior for organizations or even societies to adopt new technology or to kind of like optimize behaviors around new technology. And
So
so this is
is this the cultural change we have been talking about since the early DevOps days, or this is altogether different?
I would say that it's the same in the sense that I've kind of like retconned all of DevOps conversations I've ever had through this language around recommenting and kind of like this coming together in the middle to build the because even if you go back to like the beginning days of Puppet conversations, like the goal was always to get to these like self-service stacks for developers to be able to deploy whatever they wanted, right? And it's like we always aspired to build those systems. We always try to do those, but there's this issue that sort of sometimes happens, and it kind of in some ways is related to the product failure. It's like you build it, like you have all these central IT or sysadmin kind of centered platforms that get built in organizations, but they never got the buy-in from the other side. They never like sold the vision or how it's going to work to the BUs or the developers, and so then it's like no one uses it, or they use it a lot less than they would, and then more and more of the buying in IT is actually kind of coming through the BUs anyway, and they're like, we don't want to use this, we don't want to deal with that, we don't want to deal with you, like. So then you end up with like it seems like it's a cultural thing, but it's like really it's a mix of culture, behavior, technology. It's like all of it together, because that's the other thing I try to get people to think about is like I feel like it's a mistake to compartmentalize like, oh, this is culture stuff and this is tech stuff. It's like it's one system. It's a socio-technical system. You kind of got to think about the implications of how the choices about the process impact the choices about the technology and the choices about the personalities and egos and artwork and the rest of it, and like how that all comes together to get this work. So going back to the question about the scope economy, this is language I started using because Jabe introduced me to it, and I really like this idea. So it's this idea that we call the three economies, comes from Jabe's research, and the idea here is that you have, and it doesn't have anything to do with tech really. Like you could have the same conversation about any organization and then kind of like back into what it looks like. But I think it particularly lends itself to this conversation around platforms and maybe even 12 factor and like whatever promises you're going to keep. So you start with this core conflict, which is what Jabe calls the differentiation economy, which is a game or the kind of like, he calls it economy because it's based on the rules of this space are different. The payoffs for the way that we play this game and win is different. And I like game theory more than economics, but so I usually go to that. But it's like there's like some innovation economy, that's the differentiation economy, and then at the other end you have the scale economy, or what I think like it's easier to explain. It's more focused on efficiency and standardization, right? So one side is trying to like make everything be the same, and the other side is trying to create as much variety as it possibly can, right? And that's sort of the core conflict between dev and ops in like the very beginning of the story. But then you also have this issue where if there's not a good feedback loop, the decisions that happen here can have negative impact on the life over here.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, what's the feedback loop or what's the pain, right? So when Werner says something like you build it, you run it, what you're doing is you're keeping these promises up to this layer, and then you're making the team that makes the decisions about what gets deployed, what gets developed, suffer the consequences of those decisions, right? Because in a lot of organizations, they don't do that. So then the scope economy is this construct. And again, like these are the words that come from the research, not necessarily. If I was starting over, I might choose different words. But the scope economy is this manifestation of some kind of platform-like thing that manifests to connect the promises you want to be able to keep to efficiency and the scale economy, and the promises you want to be able to keep to the innovation economy. And so in the patterns that we already discussed, like I already talked about Netflix, I mentioned Google, Amazon, whatever. I argue that the platforms that they built, and you could argue, Heroku or like some of these other players are in there too, is like a manifestation of that clutch that connects the two, right? So you're able to provide self-service access to the developers and give them the opportunity to maximize the game they're playing, trying to innovate and create variation, while also keeping strong promises to the operators by putting that through this kind of platform that keeps promises about what the variations are, what the standards are, what the architectures are, right? And I think another way to think about this is, and this is a common pattern before, we even saw like some of this stuff, but if you're working in building the big web, like late I don't know, or even early like 2000s, you start to see this pattern. But essentially, I would argue that you only have so much variation or complexity that you can manage as an individual and as an organization, right? And so in the old enterprise lifecycle, what you have is the application and the infrastructure are married together. So it's like I have an idea, I get a sponsor, we get a PO, someone ships racks of gear, or maybe one little one use server, whatever. That gets on the network, that gets powered. Someone brings up the operating system, and now I can go develop. And that's like sort of my little thing, my own private Idaho, and I do my work on my application. And then it's like, well, we need to scale it. Well, we buy a bigger box. And then we got to virtualization. So that was the thing. And it's like, oh, well, now we're going to have like some abstraction and help it do this. But it's still kind of married in the life cycle where the infrastructure is married to the application. It's like, oh, I need these kind of things. I need this kind of thing. It's architected this way. Needs to keep these promises about IOPS. Needs to keep these promises. And it's really tied to that infrastructure. What you see the cloud natives all do, even before there's APIs for the cloud that we kind of take for granted today, is they all consolidated the bottom layers and minimize the variation, right? So it's like you went from having racks and racks in an enterprise data center where literally every single rack is different. Every rack has like, random apps and like random things and different NICs and different like blades or like all this stuff, to racks and racks and rows of identical servers and data centers, and some of them are big as a football field. And it's like that layer is consolidated, and we're gonna provide some variety through our platform services, abstracting that, and then we want to spend as much of our complexity budget as we possibly can at those higher value differentiated layers at the top where the apps are. So we're trying to minimize the variation and the complexity that we manage at the bottom of the infrastructure through the platform, keeping promises and abstractions to that, and then enable the variety, variation, complexity, or whatever to manifest in those higher value services.
Okay, so this sort of goes back to something we have been talking about for quite some time now. So on one side you have developers and business people who want to be innovative, and then you have the operations on the other side who are responsible for scale, resiliency, and also the guardrail to ensure that everything is compliant to the organizational policies. And you are talking about platforms to be that middle person who will which will provide the necessary canvas for innovation, while also ensuring that the guardrails are kept and the operations can do the job they're doing. So does it require an opinionated platform, or or we can still manage with a more flexible kind of canvas, because I know, like, my ideas have been changing here, so we evolve as we understand more, as we see the realities of the enterprise world. So what is your thought on this? Like, do we have to make the platform opinionated and impose constraints to ensure that the guardrails are kept, or we can still give a more flexible canvas, and there are ways in which we can ensure that all the policies are we are in compliance with the policies?
So I think it's more about a dial, right? Like it's not a yes or no, right? So it's more about like what is the appropriate thing for your mission for your organization. And there's another thing that I'm kind of like way into, and I'll blame John Willis for getting me so excited and worked up about this topic. But when you get into these highly regulated organizations, the rate limiting, or kind of like the thing that's preventing a lot of this change, is their posture around governance, risk, and compliance, right? And so then you have, I mean, it's crazy when you look at how some of this works, where you essentially have organizations who are so bad at keeping the attestations for their governance that when the auditors come, they're just like, take my money, right? And they just like pay the fines, right? And there's like whatever reason why that's there. So I would argue that in my opinion, you want opinions, right? You want to be able to keep promises to all the parties. Another thing I think people should think through and recognize is, like, it's not all, one size fits all. Like, you have different problems and you have different solutions that are purpose built for that problem. And then there's another language that I got introduced to Jabe, that originally comes from another CMU PhD, and I'm probably going to butcher his name, but it's Demeji Onafua, I think is his name. And he's got this like really fascinating model around managing shared resources in a Nigerian village. And that's like the model, but then he applies it to all these things. And so in some ways it provides a counterpoint to like this classic model that some people are aware of, and it has other problems around what people call the tragedy of the commons. And so the tragedy of the commons essentially argues that if you have these shared resources, then bad actors will exploit them, and it's like it's bad for everyone. And what Demeji is arguing is that there are good examples and there are ways to build these commons in such a way that it's mutually beneficial for all involved. And that requires what Demeji calls recommoning. And I started adopting this language around the act of platforming, right? So it's like we use the example of 12 factors. We use the example, which is essentially opinions, right? Like that's constraining and getting opinions, and that those opinions are enabling. Those opinions, those constraints are enabling, right? Because if you give everyone every choice, not only do you have the tyranny of the choice for those people to make it in the first place, but you also have now created all that much more variation that you have to operate on the other side of it, right? So that's what that platform is. But the recommoning step is about bringing every side, and so this is developers, operators, security, all the stakeholders, business, whatever, to come to some understanding about what they're trying to do, and negotiate their selfish interests in favor of the collective interests. Okay. Right? And so that's the recommoning step, and that's what should establish what those opinions are. So I'm in favor of opinions, but I think you want to be mindful of what those opinions should be, and also recognize that lots of DevOps conversation started in this world of startups where it's like the hard problem you're trying to solve is like cat pictures on the internet, or like some chat thing or something, and maybe you want some encryption or whatever. But at the middle of this, you have like transactional things and people's money, and maybe the things that are appropriate to put cat pictures on the internet. Those opinions might be different if I'm protecting and thinking about money. And then you go even farther and you get to systems where it's life and death. And so like medical devices, some of these cars, like these cyber physical systems, all these things that where like a bug could actually kill people, right? And so it's like the types of opinions and the type of process that you have to bring to bear to solve these problems shouldn't be identical to the kind of like what the DevOps cool kids did to put cat pictures on the internet.
This is a fascinating conversation, and I think we have already gone over the initial time of 30 minutes. But I think this can continue for another 30 minutes if I remember. But before we sort of wind up, I want to hear from you. What are some of the advice you will give to leaders who are planning on this transformation?
I mean, this is sort of what we do all day, every day. And it kind of comes to the points I was just making is one, understand what you're trying to do. Because a lot of what we see in these sort of cloud initiatives or digital transformation initiatives is somewhat rudderless, right? Like there's a board level thing that we should have the cloud first strategy, or we should have this digital initiative. Another thing we didn't bring up on this call, but is like easy to substantiate if you go look at all the literature from analysts, is most of these are failures, right? In like a big way. Like more than half of these are failures. And so like, what are you going to do to make it so your probability is better? And to me, it starts with understanding the landscape. So another thing I'm a big fan of is Wardley mapping. Like getting a shared understanding of your executive teams about what is the thing that what are we doing to create value today? What does that chain of dependencies look like? And then what are we proposing that these investments change in the dynamics of that landscape? And not, like the value is not necessarily that you have that map and that like that's the perfect representation. To me, the value is that you get a group of people who might not have the same version of reality to agree to these assumptions, these assertions, or at least talk through and put their conflicts on the table. And that gives you a chance to kind of bring these things together. So at the end of the day, to me, there's obviously technology, there's obviously, culture, process, whatever, but to the extent that the organization can recommon all of these collective interests of what it does in favor of all these individual selfish interests in favor of a collective interest, that to me seems to be the bright line determining factor between the big failures. Because what happens in most of these cases where you see the big failures, to me, is like everyone's sort of able to maximize for their local selfish interests, and like the big picture collective interest is the failure. But everyone says, well, I did my thing, I did my part. And that's like that's what's toxic. So getting people to recognize and align on some bigger mission is as much, any like the technology, any of these other like process tricks, like that's the thing that brings it all together. Do we all come to work to try to do this collective thing, to try to, it's not about configuring servers, it's not about delivering the app, it's like we're here to do this thing. And if you can get people on that, one real quick shout out, because the founder of Zappos, I had this epiphany, and there's like they had a very interesting culture, kind of the height of Tony's run at Zappos, and it was a big epiphany for me, and it sort of relates to a bunch of other themes here around culture and operations, and they had a big monitor in the building that had how many shoes did we sell in the last minute. Yeah. And every single person in that building, every single business person, every single developer, every single operator, probably the janitor, knows that we're here to sell shoes, right? And when that line changes, then that's actionable. Yeah. Like, then we have to drill down and figure out what it is, but it's like we're here to sell shoes. And that was a like 2008 timeline. So
yeah, I think in 2021, I'm going to bring you again sometime when you're free to especially discuss about using Wardley maps for sort of understanding each other's issues, identify the conflict zone, and probably like find a way in which different stakeholders can work together. I think that'll be an interesting conversation to have.
So I have a talk that I'm trying to get on InfoQ about Wardley mapping, because it's like OODA loops, Wardley mapping, a bunch of these other threads kind of coming together. I'd love to come back anytime. Feels like we should talk more often anyway. But but it was a pleasure, and I'll come back whenever you ask me.
Awesome. I think I screwed up. So, if you really liked this conversation with Andy Shafer, hit that like button. And if you want to get notified every time we go live with some guests like Andy Shafer, James Urquhart, and others, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification button so that you are notified. Thanks, Andy. It was a great conversation and looking
Smash
forward
that
to
like
having you
button.
soon. Yeah?
I said smash the like button and subscribe. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Listen to Andy, and he is right about it.